this, commercial leases are complex and it's very easy to go wrong. My rule number 2 is do your homework before you start negotiating. Make sure you have a comprehensive understanding of what's in the lease contract and know what your own requirements are. Have a clear idea of how much space you need, and for more information on that I'm going to link a separate video below which will take you through that in detail, and also know how much construction is going to be required to transform the space from a shell into a fully operational F45 franchise. You should also have a clear idea of timeline, and by that I mean A, how quickly can you move into the space and start renovations, and B, how long you're likely to need the space for. F45 franchisees tend to marry up the term of the lease with the term of the franchise agreement such that they both start around the same time and they finish at the same time. The initial term of the F45 franchise agreement is 5 years, and you have 2 options to renew that contract for 5 years each. So in lay speak, it's a 5 by 5 by 5 year agreement. So you probably want to negotiate for an initial 5-year lease term, and ideally you want to try and secure an option to renew for at least 5 years after that. Rule number 3 is make sure you have the landlord's permission to run a fitness business from the site, and definitely make sure that any offer you make is subject to council approval to do the same. The last position you want to find yourself in is locked into a long, potentially expensive lease, only to find out later that you can't do what you intended. Rule number 4, understand your costs. Carefully review all of the incidentals that you're being asked to pay for to make sure that the total cost fits your budget. For example, does the landlord require you to pay a rental deposit before you take over the lease? If so, you want to minimise that as much as possible. Be aware of something called a make good clause, which will require you to return the property back to its original condition when you hand it back to the landlord. Make good clauses can potentially be very expensive. Will there be future increases in the base rent, and how do they plan to calculate that? Once again, don't be shy to ask for clarification or changes. Rule number 5 is understand your lease options. The costs that are covered in the lease can vary greatly depending on the nature of the lease itself. In a gross rent lease, you pay a single amount to the landlord that covers the core rent as well as all the incidentals. These will typically include things like insurance, property taxes, repairs, maintenance, as well as any shared expenses relating to common areas. Another option is a modified gross lease, where you and the landlord share some combination of incidental costs. It's also possible to sign various types of net leases under which you'll agree to take on the incidental costs directly. This will usually result in lower headline rent, but obviously you'll have the additional costs that you'll pay separately. Landlords of shopping malls are known to favour something called a percentage rent lease, whereby they'll charge a base rent plus a certain percentage of your sales over an agreed minimum. Rule number 6 is know the market rates for rent. Speak to a number of commercial agents who operate in the area you're looking at and get a clear idea of how much space costs. The better informed you are, the stronger your argument is going to be when you're dealing with a landlord who might be asking for high rent. Rule number 7 is research the property. Try to get as much information as possible about the property itself. Look at the tenants who are in the building and the neighbours around it to make sure that they're compatible with your business. Find out what the traffic situation is like around the building and whether there's on-site parking. If there is on-site parking, is it allocated or can anybody use it? Talk to other local businesses in the area and find out if there are any issues that might compromise your business. For example, a major construction project nearby might impact your business, and you can potentially use that as a bargaining chip with the landlord to negotiate for better terms. And make sure you ask other agents and the tenants about the landlord's reputation to see if there are any red flags there. For example, you may find other tenants are trying to get out of the building because of issues with the landlord. Rule number 8 is seek incentives. Ask the landlord if they're willing to offer any other additional benefits to you if you rent the space. The landlord might be especially eager. For example, it may have been sitting vacant for a long time and they just want to get someone in there. It's also quite common for commercial landlords to offer a rent-free period, so you want to try and maximise as much of that rent-free period initially as possible. Believe it or not, some landlords may even be willing to finance some or part of the renovations, or they may be willing to finance the construction over the term of the lease. There's no guarantees when it comes to benefits, but as the saying goes, if you don't ask, you don't get. Rule number 9 is review the termination conditions. Make sure you know the circumstances under which either party can terminate the lease. For example, what happens if you miss a rent payment, or if the landlord sells the building? If you were to sell your business, or you just want to expand to a bigger place, will you be able to break the lease early? Most commercial leases will require you to pay out some or all of the remaining rent, but once again, you can negotiate for better terms. You also want to make sure you have an assignment clause in the contract. An assignment provision gives you the ability to transfer the lease to another party without paying a penalty necessarily. And this is useful in the event that you need to vacate the space for whatever reason, whether you choose to close the business or you want to lease another space. Rule number 10 is negotiate to preserve the value of your leasehold improvements. You will definitely be doing some construction works to transform your space into a fully functional F45 studio. Firstly, you want to be sure that your lease and the zoning actually allows you to make those improvements. And secondly, you can push for a clause in the lease that requires the landlord to reimburse you for some or all of the value of the construction if the landlord breaks the lease.
Rule number 11 is request a competitor clause. A competitor clause will require the landlord to seek your permission before granting approval for another fitness business to rent a space in the same building.
Rule number 12 is know what the conditions will be around the renewal of the lease. Commercial leases can vary from month to month to several years, so be sure you understand exactly when and under which conditions the lease can be renewed. Also be sure that you have the option to renew the lease at the end of the term if that's what you want to do. You may be able to negotiate other options into the lease, such as the right of first refusal in the event a neighbouring premises becomes available.
And last but not least is rule number 13, which is make sure you have F45 head office approval before you sign anything relating to a property. And be aware that F45 won't provide formal approval until we're provided with dimensions of the space, photos and detailed floor plans. The F45 franchise model is really versatile when it comes to real estate, but we do have strict guidelines around the appearance and the layout of every studio that we need to enforce. So once again, make sure your property is compatible with our requirements before you sign anything.
So that's it from me. I hope this has been useful. As always, if you have any questions, just hit me up on the email address below, and I look forward to you tuning in next time.